Howdy. I've been reading a lot with you from the last Voices of World War II. It's a special a series of reports in the National Geographic this month. Right now I'm going to share the voices of this man and a woman who survived World War II. The man's name is Eugene Polinski, and the woman's name is Valtteri Feld. Okay. The story about Eugene. He's a Grammy-winning producer, playwright, and actor. His name is Eugene Polinski. He flew clandestine missions over Nazi-occupied Belgium, France, and Norway during the war. Instead of unleashing bombs, his 8-man American crew dropped Allied agents, weapons, motorbikes, cash, and other vital supplies to resistance fighters as far as a part of a mission called Operation Carpetbagger. I didn't know what I was doing, said Polinski, now 99. I didn't know what I was carrying. I would have been terrified. The Carpetbaggers were the air arm of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the U.S. intelligence agency that ran espionage and sabotage operations. Between 1944 and 1945, the Carpetbaggers dropped more than 500 agents and some 5,000 tons of supplies into hostile territory. They flew late and low so as that the plane's bellies snagged tree branches. They told us if you're shot down, if they capture you, you'll be shot as a spy yourself, Polinski says, so don't get shot down. Great advice, he says. Born in Manhattan on September 11th, 1920, Polinski was the son of a Russian Jewish immigrant. When he arrived in England for duty with the 8th Air Force, his crew was assigned to his stripped-down B-24 Liberator. It was painted black to blend into the night. Hours before a mission, the ground crew loaded supply containers into the plane's bomb bay. Just before takeoff, agents known to the airmen only as Joes and Josephines sometimes slipped aboard. As navigator, Polinski squatted on a gun case toward the nose of the cramped, freezing Liberator, directing the pilot to the target. When they neared the drop zone, the pilot dipped low as 300 feet. And upon spotting signal lights from alleys below, the dispatcher sent the night's load parachuting out. Back in England, officers waited and hoped the number of crews that took off the previous night would match the number that landed before the sun rose. But 42 Carpetbagger planes never returned, and 21 more were mangled beyond repair. More than 200 of Polinski's fellow airmen ended up missing, imprisoned, or killed in combat. You saw the 18 and 19-year-olds come in to replace people, Polinski says. You were an old man if you were still there at 23. If we let it bother us, it would destroy us. You had to just go on. In August 1945, after a successful drop over Belgium, Polinski's crew returned from their 35th mission. The magic number for a ticket home. Their final orders were, forget everything. And so he did for many years. Then, in 2001, just 19 years ago, Polinski received a mysterious invitation to a reception in Belgium, celebrating a new book about an elaborate Allied operation to liberate the port of Antwerp in 1944. Polinski never knew he had played an important part in the mission until his host, the former head of the Belgian resistance, told him the story. We were friends all these years, he said, only you were up in the air and I was down on the ground. You want your whole life to do something, the veteran says, to find out that you did it when you were just a kid and you didn't know it? Well, that's a strange feeling. There he is again, Eugene Polinski. And there's his crew. He says only he is alive out of his crew. Let me share another story from this wonderful magazine tribute to the surviving veterans of World War II and their children survivors of World War II. We have in this woman, Valtteri Pless, such a child survivor of World War II. Here is her story. Even as a child, Valtteri Feld couldn't help but see the many ways that Germans were benefits of the Nazi regime. She didn't have to look far. Her parents were broke when Hitler rose in power in 1933. 6 years later, her father was an officer in the Waffen-SS, the Nazi Party's elite military division. By the time he went off to fight in the invasion of France, the family had 2 cars, a nice house, and a warehouse full of valuable second-hand furniture. Where did all this money come from? Pless asked. It's clear to me now it could only have come from Jewish households. No one can tell me he didn't know Jews were persecuted. Her father once plopped her in the car for an errand to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp on the edge of Berlin. I saw the people there, how they were living, she says. Was she shocked? The impeccably dressed 84-year-old shakes her head and shrugs. Things like that were just given back then. Then suddenly they weren't. In the fall of 1944, Pless saw the roads around their family's home, more than 100 miles east of Berlin, filling with families fleeing the Soviet Union. For weeks, she slept in her clothes, ready to join the river of refugees at any moment. Finally, on a freezing night in February 1945, the evacuation order came. I thought it was temporary, she recalls. As soon as the Russians were defeated, we'd be back home. That's how powerful the Nazi propaganda was at the time. After weeks on the move, sleeping in strangers' apartments and railway stations, she and her mother, brother, and sister were shipped to a peninsula on Germany's Baltic coast, where a tourist destination had plenty of beds. But in April, the rapidly advancing Soviets cut off access to the mainland and there was nothing to eat. Without electricity or radios, Pless and her family were unaware of Germany's surrender until they heard a celebratory gunfire from Soviet Union units garrisoned in a nearby house. Constantly hungry, Pless spent that spring searching for food. One day, she says, she followed a farmer's cart as it bounced along a cobbled road, gathering spilled potatoes into her skirt. Before she knew it, she was alone in a field far from town. That's when a Russian soldier grabbed me and raped me, she says. She was 9 years old. Pless says she ran home to tell her mother, but her screams were met with silence. That fall, the family got word that Pless's father had survived the fall of Berlin and was interned by the British in northern Germany, but there would be no going home. The village was now Polish territory. Yeah, they took part of what was Germany and they gave it to Poland at the end of the war. For the next decade, the reunited family struggled, living first in pig stalls and then barns, later crowding into small apartments with other families. In the lean post-war years, many Germans resented Pless and the millions of other refugees who came from the east. They were displaced by the conflict and they were just extra mouths to feed. They discriminated against us, cursed at us, she says, just because we were refugees. Yeah, and I remember you often didn't get these stories from people until late in their lives. Just 10, 12 years ago, I was living in Wiesbaden, Germany, and a woman in her late 80s shared the same thing, how they were discriminated against when she came from the east to live in the west, western part of Germany. 75 years later, Pless feels neither anger nor guilt. There are truly tragic stories out there. Mine, by comparison, is almost trivial, she says. I was 9. The war wasn't my fault, but I'm not a victim either. Today, Pless visits schools in the Hamburg area to talk about her wartime experiences, motivated, she says, by concern. Look at the world now. People haven't learned. It's horrifying that neo-Nazis are back, not just in Germany, but in the US, in Scandinavia. People are still so easily manipulated. Yes, people are manipulated by propaganda. And it's funny because there's so much information out there. You'd think having access to it would enable empower people not to be fooled by the propaganda. I'm going to share next from Ted Gope's story about survivors of the bombing of Hiroshima. Okay, more than 7 decades after its devastation, Hiroshima has moved on, but for the remaining survivors, the horrors of nuclear attack and the lessons of war remain vivid. Here's a view of what the U.S. photographed at the end of World War II when they arrived in Hiroshima. Nine days after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, after his parents and year-old brother died and his home was incinerated, 7-year-old Masaki Tanabe watched his father slip away. His last words, "I see no future as an army officer." An implacable enemy of America, Tanabe's father died with his sword at his side. Tanabe's grandfather wanted to keep his son's sword, but the occupation forces came and wrested it from him. Barbarians, young Tanabe thought. He was determined to take revenge against America, he says. Understandable. He had nothing and almost no one left. His home had been next to the Hiroshima Dome. It's called the Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall. The now iconic building with the skeletal dome preserved as an appeal for nuclear forbearance. Here's some more pictures of Hiroshima. Thanks to the U.S. military, took pictures afterwards. Now in his 80s, Tanabe is a handsome man, square-jawed and silver-browed. He is tradition personified in his gray jinbei robe with wide sleeves. He's also resourceful and adaptive. He became a filmmaker and studied computer graphics so he could construct a cyber version of the city that the bomb had erased. The result, Message from Hiroshima, a film that includes interviews with survivors of August 6, 1945, bombing, along with the atomic bombing of Nagasaki 3 days later, that would kill up to 200,000 people, force Japan's surrender in World War II, and render unnecessary an Allied invasion of Japan that could have cost millions and millions of more lives. Tanabe couldn't have predicted the wrenching changes that awaited him and Japan. His daughter married an American and settled in the United States. Tanabe's long wrestled with the idea that she had embraced the enemy. 2 or 3 years after the wedding, Tanabe discovered a letter his daughter had left at the base of a stone Buddha in Yamaguchi Prefecture, where her grandfather, Tanabe's father, had died. In it, she told her grandfather she was sorry if she had disappointed him. As the years passed, Tanabe, like much of his generation, reconciled himself to a changed world. 75 years after the war's end, Tanabe's story is the story of Hiroshima and of Japan itself, a mix of tradition and modernity, of a determination never to forget, but also a commitment not to be defined solely by the past. As with Tanabe, events personal and public have yoked the two former enemies, Japan and America, to a shared future and present. Each August 6th, the city pays homage to its 135,000 plus A-bomb victims, adding more names to a cenotaph. All other days of the year, its focus is decidedly forward. Today, Hiroshima has a near messianic zeal as the world's champion of denuclearization, but it's also a vibrant hub for recreation, research, and commerce. After the bomb fell, Hiroshima was full of miraculous accounts of services restored, water, electricity, streetcars, and of unheralded heroes over the next decade. Heroes who came from far and wide, who helped bring the city back to life. And I will share more of those in another story from this National Geographic. That's the oldest veteran of the World War II. He's 110 years old. He's an American. His name is Lawrence Brooks. Anyway, let's learn more about this and think about it. Pass on the past, learn from it, live for the future. Okay, this is the Kevin Stoda channel. I hope you enjoyed what you're watching. Take care.